In today's lecture, we're going to be talking about your first speech, which covers the appendix chapter of your textbook. But in addition to that, we are going to be talking about a little bit about chapter 14, which is the delivery chapter. And from this chapter, we're going to be talking about the 4 different methods of delivery that one can have for a speech, before then talking about the basic steps that you need to take in order to build your first speech. Now, it is important to note that these steps that we are going to be going over today serve as a very broad overview of how to build your first speech. So it's important that you still look at the individual chapters about each of the steps that we will be covering today, rather than just relying on the appendix as a summary of how to build a speech. But before we get to any of that, we're going to talk first about those 4 methods of delivery for a public speech. So when it comes to your speeches, there's a lot of work that goes into preparing a speech. You spend a lot of time writing the speech ahead of time, researching it, making sure that you have all of your ideas in the proper order, and it's tempting to not want to mess that up because you've worked so hard on it. So it can be tempting to read your speech word for word, but as we'll see, there are a lot of problems that come along with reading a text word for word. And we can also see that delivery of your speech is actually going to be very important, if not one of the most important aspects of your speech, because you can do all of the work of preparing your speech and making sure that you have all of the sources, but if your delivery isn't there, no one's going to listen to your message anyway. So delivery is a really, really important part of this whole process. Now, speaking is more formal than regular talking. For example, having a conversation with a friend. You have to make yourself presentable when you're giving a speech. You might want to be well groomed, be wearing clean clothes, not necessarily a suit and tie or a skirt and heels or anything along those lines, but you want to be wearing appropriate clothing. And you want to be doing things like maintaining eye contact with your audience and looking like you know your topic really, really well. On the other hand, speaking is less formal than reading. It allows for things like pausing to make dramatic impact, making eye contact with your audience. It allows you to change slightly the way that you are saying things. You're not as tied to that script. And it allows you to have more vocal variety throughout your speech. So speaking overall provides a much more animated message than simply reading does, but it is still more formal than having a conversation because you've planned the whole thing out ahead of time. With all that being said, we need to talk about 4 different methods of giving a public speech. And these are going to be impromptu speaking, manuscript, memorized, and extemporaneous speaking. So let's dive into each of these in turn. First, let's talk about impromptu speaking. Impromptu speaking is the presentation of a short message without advanced preparation. Oftentimes, impromptu speeches are given when someone is asked to say a few words or give a toast at some sort of special occasion. You might have encountered impromptu speaking whenever you've been asked to give an impromptu self-introduction at the beginning of a new class. Now, there are some advantages to giving an impromptu speech. For one, it sounds very spontaneous, very animated, and it sounds very conversational as well. Impromptu speaking is probably the most similar form of public speaking to simply having a conversation with a friend. It sounds natural, it just sounds like you're talking with someone, right? Because when you're talking with someone, you don't really plan that whole thing out ahead of time. So impromptu speaking is very, very similar to conversations in that way. But in a public speaking setting, there are some disadvantages to doing an impromptu speech. For one, there's very little time to plan, or no time at all sometimes. And so it's very difficult to contemplate the central theme of your message. And oftentimes, this can cause your message to become disorganized and really hard to follow for your audience. So we will be doing an impromptu speech. Or rather, we will be doing various forms of impromptu speaking just to kind of hone those skills. But for the majority of this class, we will not be relying on impromptu speaking because we are going to be planning out our speeches much in advance. So that's impromptu speaking. Sounds conversational, but it might be disorganized. Next, we have speaking from a manuscript, or as I like to call it, public reading. So speaking from a manuscript is when you have a word-for-word iteration of a written message. And this makes it so that your speech is very exact. So there's a couple advantages here as well. Like I said, you have the exact repetition of the original words that you wanted to say. So you've planned this speech out, you've written it out word for word, and you are saying every single word that is on that page. And in some cases, this can be really important. For example, if you are a politician or a lawyer or something along those lines, sometimes the wording of what you say really does matter. So it can be important in specific instances. But like the others, it has some disadvantages. So first and foremost, speaking from a manuscript can be really uninteresting. And this is because when you are reading from a script, oftentimes we fall into a sort of monotone voice because we're more focused on the words on the page than on our delivery. And in addition to this, there's a really serious lack of eye contact, and you have little to no connection with the audience. Because if you're reading from a manuscript, your eyes are going to be on that page the entire time. And because of this disconnect, your audience is much less likely to listen to your speech, and all of your hard work kind of goes out the door anyway. So we try to stay away from manuscript delivery as much as possible because we are not practiced public speakers and we don't have teleprompters. So we don't have the skills to be able to successfully read from a manuscript like a politician would be able to. Next, we have speaking from memory. Now, memorized speaking is the rote recitation of a written message that a speaker has committed to memory. So it's very similar to a manuscript delivery in that you have carefully planned out every single word that you want to say. But now instead of reading it off of the page, you have memorized the whole thing. It's all in your head. So instead of it being in front of you, it's all in your memory and you are pulling it from your memory as you are delivering it. So some advantages to speaking from memory is that now, as opposed to manuscripts delivery, it enables the speaker to maintain eye contact with the audience. So there's a little bit more of a connection there, right? The speaker is able to look at the audience and the audience is probably more likely to pay attention to your speech. In addition, memorizing your speech gives you the ability to freely move around the stage because now you are not going to be tied to your notes on a podium, for example. You will be able to interact with different sides of the audience and gesture much more freely. But there's some pretty clear disadvantages here. First, similar to a manuscript delivery, memorized delivery can come off as flat, uninteresting, and monotone at times because we're working so hard to remember word for word what it is that we wrote down in the first place. In addition, you might end up losing your place if you are reciting from memory, or even worse, going blank altogether. And especially for novice public speakers, this can be really difficult to recover from. So, in addition to impromptu and manuscript delivery, we also discourage memorized delivery because really one of the most kind of damaging things to someone's confidence is standing up in front of an audience and just completely going blank, forgetting what it was that you wanted to say. So I don't want you to memorize your speeches. So how is it you're supposed to deliver these speeches then? Well, you're going to be delivering your speeches extemporaneously. Extemporaneous speaking is the presentation of a carefully planned and rehearsed speech. And it's spoken in a very conversational manner. So you have planned out about what you want to say. You know what your main points are going to be. You know what you want to say in those main points, but you're talking about it as though you're explaining something to a friend. Some advantages include that you are able to establish eye contact with your audience and actually respond to the feedback that they are giving you. So for example, let's say that you're giving your speech and you see someone kind of looking glazed or lost, or they have a furrowed eyebrow or something like that. They look confused in some way. You can take that cue and say, okay, they're not understanding something. How can I make this more clear? And you can elaborate further on your point. You can provide more concrete examples of what it is that you're talking about to make sure that your audience understands what you're talking about. You can't do that with a memorized speech. In addition, speaking extemporaneously helps you to be perceived as more knowledgeable and credible, because your audience looks at you and says, wow, they're just basically having a conversation with me about this topic, and they know a lot about it. So they look at you and say, okay, you know what you're talking about. So extemporaneous speaking is really, really advantageous. Really, the only drawback to extemporaneous speaking is that it takes a lot of time to prepare. So you can't really do it the night before. Sorry to break the bad news to you. So those are the 4 main ways that we can deliver a speech: impromptu, manuscript, memorized, and extemporaneous. So now take a look at the videos that I've posted to see examples of each of these.